My son's fiancée called me an ugly old cow in French, right at my own dinner table. She was planning to marry him for a green card, then divorce him for his inheritance. She thought I was just a clueless American who couldn't understand a word. She didn't know she was speaking the native tongue of my late wife. She didn't know she wasn't just insulting me, she was arming me. And as I smiled and passed the bread, I began building the trap she would spend the rest of her life regretting. Before I tell you how I did it, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you believe that wisdom, patience, and truth are the most powerful weapons of all. The call came on a Tuesday, the kind of gray Boston afternoon where the sky hangs low and heavy, the color of old pewter. I was in my study, surrounded by the quiet company of my books, the scent of aging paper and leather, a constant comfort. For a retired history professor, these walls were more than a library. They were a fortress of memory, a silent testament to a life spent sifting through the past. The face that appeared on my tablet screen was my son, Ethan, his expression so bright it seemed to fight the gloom of the day. He was 35, a man grown, yet in that moment, his eyes held the unshielded excitement of a boy with a wonderful secret. "Dad," he said, his voice buzzing with an energy I hadn't heard in years. "You sitting down?" I adjusted my glasses and leaned back in my worn leather chair. "I am, Ethan. What's going on?" He took a deep breath, unable to contain his smile. "I asked her. Dad, I asked Isabel to marry me, and she said yes." The words hung in the air between us. Isabel Moreau, the Frenchwoman he'd met on a business trip to Paris 6 months ago. A whirlwind romance conducted mostly over screens and thousands of miles of ocean. I knew I was supposed to feel an uncomplicated surge of joy, a father's pride. But instead, a cold, quiet caution settled in my bones. 6 months. It felt like the time it takes for seasons to change, not for two lives to merge. "Well, son," I managed, forcing a smile I hoped looked genuine. That's wonderful news. Congratulations." "She's incredible, Dad. I mean it. She's smart, she's beautiful, she gets me. It feels like I've known her my whole life." He was rambling, a torrent of adoration. I listened, nodding, my mind snagging on the timeline. He'd spent a total of maybe 4 weeks in the same physical city as her. I thought of my late wife, Sophie. It had taken us 2 years of letters, of long walks and longer conversations, before we even considered a future together. We built our foundation brick by brick. Ethan's felt like a prefabricated house dropped onto a plot of land he'd barely surveyed. "I'm happy for you, son. Truly," I said, and I meant it. His happiness was paramount. "When do I get to meet the woman who's stolen my son's heart?" "That's the other thing. She and her parents, they want to fly out to meet you, formally, next month." A knot tightened in my stomach. The whole family. It felt less like a meeting and more like an inspection, a delegation. "Of course," I said. "I'd be honored." We talked for a few more minutes, but my mind was already turning over the details. Sophie had been French, a woman of genuine grace and quiet strength. She had taught me her language, her culture, her way of seeing the world. She had an instinct for people, an almost unnerving ability to see past the polished surface to the true grain beneath. And as I looked at my son's beaming, unguarded face, I felt a pang of her absence more acutely than I had in years. I wished she were here. She would know, in an instant, if this Isabel was everything my son believed her to be. I, on the other hand, would have to learn. And my specialty had always been history, the patient study of records and facts until the truth, however deeply buried, revealed itself. A week later, Ethan arranged the video call. I sat in my study, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. My screen split into 4 neat squares. There was Ethan, looking proud and slightly nervous. There was me, trying to project warmth and openness. And then there were them. The Moreau family. Isabel was, I had to admit, stunning. She had dark, intelligent eyes, a smile that seemed both warm and perfectly crafted. And she spoke English with a charming, melodic French accent. She was 28, poised and confident. She immediately launched into a flawless performance, praising Ethan's brilliance, his kindness, and then turned her attention to me. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice like honey, "Ethan has told me so much about you. A distinguished professor. I have such a deep respect for men of intellect. It is a quality so rare these days." I smiled politely. "Please, call me Arthur." Her parents, Antoine and Celine, were equally polished. He was a handsome man with silvering hair and a tailored suit that seemed a little too fine for a video call. Celine was chic and elegant, her expression one of pleasant neutrality. They spoke of their family as one of a distinguished lineage in Lyon, peppered with mentions of vineyards and ancestral homes. But it was all couched in the soft language of past glory. Antoine made a vague reference to some unfortunate business reversals and the unpredictability of the modern economy. It was a classic tale of old money facing temporary hardship, plausible, yet somehow hollow. The conversation flowed smoothly. They asked about my career, about Boston. Isabel spoke of her dream of moving to America, of starting a family. It was all perfect, too perfect. It felt like a script, rehearsed until every line was delivered with effortless conviction. My historian's brain, trained to spot inconsistencies and question narratives, was on high alert. Then came the moment. It was so small, so fleeting, that anyone else would have missed it. Ethan was talking about his company, about a new round of funding that had just valued his startup at a staggering figure. As he said the number, I saw it. It wasn't a smile or a nod. It was a flicker, a micro-expression. Isabel's eyes darted to her mother, just for a fraction of a second. Celine's lips tightened in a barely perceptible smirk of satisfaction. It was the silent, instantaneous communication of two predators who had just heard the confirmation of their praise value. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by practiced smiles of admiration. But I had seen it. It was a crack in the perfect facade, a glimpse of the cold machinery working just beneath the surface. I also noted a small historical slip. Antoine mentioned an ancestor who was supposedly granted a title by Napoleon III, but he named the wrong duchy, one that was dissolved decades before Napoleon III came to power. A minor error, the kind a history professor would notice, but a significant one. It told me their story of a distinguished lineage was not just embellished, it was likely fabricated. After the call ended, Ethan called me back immediately, his voice bubbling with excitement. "So, what did you think? Isn't she amazing?" I chose my words carefully. "She is very charming, Ethan, and her parents are very polished." He caught the hesitation in my voice. "Polished? What does that mean, Dad? Don't do this." "Do what, son?" "I just want to get to know them. It all seems to be happening very quickly." "Because it's right," he insisted, a defensive edge to his tone. "When you know, you know." I thought you, of all people, would understand that. He was referring to my whirlwind courtship with his mother, but he had the facts wrong. Ours was not a whirlwind. It was a deep, steady current. This felt different. This felt like a storm. But I knew pushing him now would only drive him further away. I had to bide my time. The next call came a few days later. Ethan was all business. "They're coming," he announced. "Second week of November. I'm booking their flights, first class, and a suite at the Four Seasons. We need to make a good impression." "A good impression?" I asked quietly. "Son, you're the one paying for it all." "I think the impression has been made," he sighed, a sound of pure frustration. "Dad, this is how it's done. They're her family. We need to show them respect." "I agree," I said, "which is why I would like to host a dinner for all of us. Just the five of us. There's a place in the city, Le Coeur. You remember it." He fell silent. Of course he remembered. It was a small, elegant French restaurant, his mother's favorite. It was where we had celebrated every anniversary, every significant milestone. It was a place of ghosts and beautiful memories, a place I hadn't returned to since she passed away. Taking them there felt important. It was a test. I wanted to see how this perfect, polished woman and her family behaved in a space that was sacred to my past, to the memory of the only other woman I had ever loved. "I don't know, Dad," Ethan said. his voice soft now. Isn't that a little heavy for a first meeting? It's a good restaurant, Ethan. It serves authentic French food. I thought they would appreciate it. I could hear the conflict in his voice. He was torn between placating me and protecting his new fragile world with Isabel. The desire to believe in the dream was so strong. He wanted my approval, but he didn't want me to look too closely. Okay, Dad, he finally conceded. Okay, we'll do it your way. The dinner is on me, though. Then his voice hardened slightly, a plea wrapped in a demand. Just, please, please don't make this difficult. I really love her. I looked out my study window at the gray, unforgiving sky. I know you do, son, I said softly. That's why I'm doing this. I hung up the phone, the silence of the room closing in around me. The plan was set. The stage was being prepared, and I felt a cold sense of foreboding, the feeling a historian gets when he knows he is about to witness a pivotal event, one that will change the course of everything that comes after. Liqueur was not merely a restaurant. It was a museum of moments. Each table, each chair, seemed to hold an echo of a time when Sophie and I had sat there, mapping out our future over coq au vin and shared bottles of Bordeaux. The air itself felt thick with memory, scented with butter, wine, and the ghost of her perfume. As the five of us were led to a quiet corner table, I felt like a custodian of a sacred place, ushering in potential vandals. Ethan was oblivious, of course. He was a man floating on a cloud of his own making, pointing out the architectural details, translating the menu with a flourish, his eyes rarely leaving Isabel's face. She, in turn, played her part to perfection. She listened with rapt attention, her head tilted just so, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm. Her parents, Antoine and Celine, offered polished compliments on the restaurant's ambiance, their conversation as smooth and flavorless as pasteurized cheese. "It is truly a classic establishment, Arthur," Antoine said, raising his wine glass. "A testament to good taste. You and your late wife must have shared many wonderful evenings here." "We did," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. The mention of Sophie in his mouth felt like a profanity. The first course arrived, an elaborate construction of scallops and foam. The conversation remained in English, a dance of pleasantries. Ethan spoke of the future, of the house he and Isabel were looking at in Brookline. Isabel spoke of her desire for children, for a life filled with family and meaning. She looked at me as she said it, her eyes wide with manufactured sincerity. It was a masterful performance. She was selling a fantasy, and my son was her most eager customer. I ate my scallops, each bite tasteless. I was an audience member at a play where I was the only one who knew the actors were liars. Then, halfway through the main course, it happened. Ethan was happily recounting a story about a college prank, a harmless anecdote that had everyone smiling. He was turned slightly towards Antoine, fully engaged. Seeing her moment, Isabel leaned across the table towards her mother, creating a small, intimate triangle of conspiracy with her parents. She lowered her voice, switching to French, assuming I was nothing more than the smiling, monolingual American elder at the end of the table. But the language she spoke was the language of my heart. It was the language Sophie had whispered to me in the dark, the language she had used to sing our son to sleep. Every syllable was as clear to me as my own name. Celine began, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Son fils semble vraiment épris de toi. His son seems truly captivated by you." Isabel let out a soft, contemptuous laugh, a sound completely alien to the sweet girl who had been sitting there moments before. She took a delicate sip of her wine. "Bien sûr qu'il l'est. Of course he is." She glanced at me, a dismissive flick of her eyes. My mind translated her next words with brutal, instantaneous clarity. "Cette vieille vache est peut-être ennuyeuse, mais son fils est parfait." This ugly old cow may be boring, but her son is perfect. The insult was so casual, so venomous, it felt like a physical blow. A cold fury began to uncoil in my chest. My wife's memory, our life, our son. All of it was just a tedious obstacle, a piece of scenery in her grand play. She continued, her voice a low murmur. Il est riche, naïf, et c'est mon ticket d'or. He's rich, naive, and he's my golden ticket. My hands remained perfectly still on the table. I brought my fork to my lips, chewed the piece of duck, and swallowed. My face was a mask of pleasant interest. Inside, a war had just been declared. Antoine, her father, leaned forward. Quel est le plan? What's the plan? Isabelle didn't hesitate. She outlined the destruction of my son's life as if she were ordering dessert. Je l'épouserai pour la carte verte, puis je divorcerai et prendrai la moitié de son héritage et de sa société. I'll marry him for the green card, then I'll divorce him and take half his inheritance and his company. The words were precise, surgical. This wasn't just greed, it was a battle plan. She finished with a final, triumphant declaration. Nous n'aurons plus jamais à nous soucier de nos dettes. We'll never have to worry about debt again. Ethan finished his story and turned back to the table, smiling. And that's how I almost got expelled. Isabel's sweet smile snapped back into place. Oh, Ethan, you were so naughty, she chirped in English, reaching over to playfully touch his cheek. I watched her, my heart beating a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. The pain for my son was a physical ache, but beneath it, something else was taking shape. The patient, methodical mind of the historian was taking over. I was no longer a father at dinner. I was an operative behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence. I nodded, I smiled, I passed the salt. For the rest of the meal, I observed them, cataloging every lie, every false gesture, every predatory gleam in their eyes that they thought no one could see. Finally, the evening drew to a close. We stood near the entrance, the valets bringing the cars around. I endured the false embraces, the airy kisses on both cheeks from Celine and Isabelle. I shook Antoine's hand first, my grip firm. It was a pleasure, I said in clear, untroubled English. He smiled, a self-satisfied expression on his face. Then, I turned to the two women. I looked at Celine, then my eyes settled on Isabelle. I gave her a small, polite smile, the same empty smile she had given me all night. And in the quiet, elegant lobby of the restaurant my wife had loved, I spoke. My French was flawless, the accent perfect, every word delivered with the cold, calm precision of a death sentence. J'ai adoré vous rencontrer. I loved meeting you all. Their smiles faltered for a second, confused. I held Isabelle's gaze and delivered the final blow. Je parie que les services de l'immigration les feront aussi. I bet immigration will too. The transformation was instantaneous. The color drained from their faces. Isabelle's mouth fell slightly open, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated panic. Celine's hand flew to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Antoine, overhearing me, froze with his car door half open. The masks didn't just crack, they disintegrated, revealing the terrified, cornered grifters beneath. I didn't wait for a response. I gave a final, tiny nod, turned my back on their silent, collective horror, and walked out into the cold New York night. The war had begun, and I had just fired the first shot. The drive back to my house was a blur of streetlights and shadows. The city's symphony of sirens and distant traffic was muted, drowned out by the echo of Isabelle's words, playing on a loop in my mind. Cette vieille vache, this ugly old cow. Mon ticket d'or, my golden ticket. The phrases were sharp little knives twisting in my gut. It wasn't the insult to me that cut the deepest. It was the chilling, transactional way she spoke of my son. He wasn't a person to her. He was a prize, an asset to be acquired and liquidated. I pulled into the garage, the automatic door closing with a heavy thud, sealing me in the sudden, profound silence of my home. I walked through the dark rooms, not bothering to turn on the lights. The house felt alien, the familiar spaces tainted by the ugliness of what I now knew. I went straight to my study, the room that had always been my sanctuary, and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady. The anger was not a hot, explosive thing. It was a block of ice forming in my chest, cold and dense and heavy. I sank into my leather armchair, the one Sophie had always claimed was the most comfortable spot in the house. My eyes fell upon the silver-framed photograph on my desk. It was Sophie, 20 years ago, laughing in the garden of our old home. Her eyes crinkled at the corners, her smile so genuine it seemed to radiate warmth right through the glass. She was the standard against which I measured all human connection, the embodiment of a love that was giving, not taking. And in that moment, I felt as if she were in the room with me, her presence a silent, urgent question. What will you do, Arthur? What will you do to protect our boy? The pain for Ethan was immense, a physical ache of helplessness. I saw his face at the table, so full of love and blind trust. He was laying his entire future at the feet of a predator, and he couldn't see the teeth hiding behind her perfect smile. I had raised him to be a good man, to be trusting and open-hearted. It felt like a cruel irony that the very qualities I had nurtured in him were now being used as weapons against him. He was walking into a meticulously planned ambush, and my heart broke at the thought of the devastation that awaited him. Just then, the silence was shattered by the sharp ring of my phone. I glanced at the screen. Ethan. Of course. I let it ring 3 times, composing myself, pushing the ice block of fury down, and dredging up the calm, paternal voice he was used to hearing. I answered, "Dad?" What was that? His voice was a jumble of confusion and concern. "At the restaurant. That thing you said in French. Isabel and her parents got really weird after you left. What did you say to them?" Here it was, the first battle. The temptation to unleash the truth, to scream a warning down the phone line, was immense. But my historian's mind took over, analyzing the strategic landscape. If I told him now what would happen, he wouldn't believe me. He would think I was a jealous, overprotective old man trying to sabotage his happiness. He would confront Isabel. She would cry, deny everything, and paint me as the villain. He would choose her. He would defend her. And in doing so, he would push me away, isolating himself completely, leaving himself even more vulnerable. I would not only fail to save him, I would lose him. I had to lie. It was the most painful, necessary lie I had ever told. I forced a small, weary chuckle into my voice. "Ethan, relax." It was nothing. It wasn't nothing, Dad. Their faces, they looked like they'd seen a ghost. "What did you say?" "It's an old saying from Lyon, where they're from," I improvised, reaching for a plausible, academic-sounding explanation. "A sort of toast. It's a bit of dark humor, really. It basically means, may your future be as interesting as the tax authorities find you." It's a dry, provincial joke. I'm surprised they took it so seriously. They must be more stressed about the wedding plans than I thought. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him processing it, wanting to believe it. "A joke? That's it?" "That's it, son," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I was just trying to connect with them in their own culture. Maybe my accent was off. Don't worry about it. It was a wonderful dinner. She's a lovely girl. He let out a long sigh, the tension releasing from his voice. "Okay, Dad. Okay. You had me worried. I thought you were trying to start a fight or something." "Never," I lied again. "I just want you to be happy." "I am," he said, his voice full of conviction. "I really am." We said our goodbyes and I hung up the phone, the silence in the study rushing back in, colder and heavier than before. I had bought myself time. I had kept my line of communication with my son open, but I had also just let him walk back toward the cliff's edge. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark, sleeping houses of my neighbors. The decision was no longer a question. It was a conclusion. There would be no more warnings, no more appeals to reason. Words were useless against this kind of enemy. I needed facts. I needed evidence. I needed proof so cold, so hard, and so undeniable that it would shatter my son's beautiful fantasy to pieces. It would be brutal. It would be painful. But it was the only way to save him. The sleepless night ahead was no longer a trial to be endured. It was a resource to be used, a time to plan, a time to think. The war had been declared in secret, and my first move had been to feign surrender. Sleep did not come that night. It was not a night for rest, but for contemplation. The anger and the pain settled, not into despair, but into a cold, hard resolve. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through my window, I was already dressed. I made coffee with a steady hand, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in a world that had just been torn from its moorings. There was only one person I could trust with this, one person who had the skill, the discretion, and the necessary cynicism to see this situation for what it was. By 7 a.m., I was on the Acela Express from Boston to New York. Watching the New England landscape blur past the window, I felt a strange sense of calm. The decision had been made. The path, however difficult, was clear. There was no more room for doubt, only for action. Mark Davis's office was on the 50th floor of a glass and steel tower in Midtown Manhattan. The view from his window was a breathtaking panorama of the city, a testament to a man who had reached the very top of his profession. Mark himself had changed little since our college days. He was leaner, his hair was more silver than black, but his eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, and missing nothing. He was one of the most feared immigration lawyers in the country, a man who understood the labyrinthine rules of the system better than the people who had written them. He greeted me not with pity, but with the firm handshake of an old friend who knew something was deeply wrong. He poured 2 cups of coffee himself, dismissed his assistant, and closed the heavy oak door to his office. The silence was absolute. "All right, Arthur," he said, his voice low and serious. "You sounded like you were on your way to a funeral. Talk to me." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I recounted the events of the previous evening with the dispassionate precision of a historian presenting a paper. I described the video calls, the fabricated story of their lineage, and the subtle, greedy flicker in Celine's eyes. Then I walked him through the dinner at La Cour, moment by moment. I repeated Isabel's words in the original French, my voice flat and devoid of the emotion that was churning inside me. "Cette vieille vache," I recited, "mon ticket d'or." I told him the entire plan she had laid out, her chilling words about the green card, the divorce, and taking half of my son's company. When I finished, Mark didn't express shock or outrage. He simply leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He had a look on his face I'd seen before, the look of a doctor who has just recognized the symptoms of a familiar malignant disease. "Marriage fraud," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis. "It's a tale as old as time, Arthur. The players change, the accents change, but the game is always the same. Greed wrapped in a wedding dress." "I know what it is, Mark," I said. "The question is, what do we do about it? I have to protect my son." He nodded slowly. "Protecting him is one thing. Convincing him is another. Ethan is in love. He's in the fog. Right now, your word against hers is nothing. You're the concerned father. She's the beautiful, charming fiancée. Who do you think he's going to believe? So what do you need?" "Evidence," Mark said, his voice becoming sharp and clinical. "The legal standard for proving marriage fraud is high. We have to demonstrate fraudulent intent prior to the marriage. We have to prove, to a legal certainty, that she never intended to build a life with him, that the marriage itself is a tool to achieve a different end, in this case, immigration status and financial gain. Your testimony about the dinner is a powerful start, but it's still your word against theirs. They'll say you misheard. They'll say you're a lonely old man making things up. They will try to destroy your credibility." He stood up and began to pace in front of the vast window, a general mapping out a battlefield. "We need more. We need something they can't deny. We need documents. We need communications. We need financial records. We need to build a fortress of evidence so high and so thick that they can't climb over it, and so solid that when we push, their whole world comes crashing down." He stopped and looked at me, his eyes locking onto mine. "And to do that, you are going to have to do the hardest thing you have ever done in your life." "What's that?" "Nothing," Mark said. "You are going to go back to Boston, and you are going to play the part of the loving, supportive, future father-in-law. You are going to smile. You are going to help them plan their wedding. You are going to listen to their lies, and you are going to nod and pretend to believe every single word. You must become the harmless, slightly doddering old man they already think you are. You are our Trojan horse, Arthur. You have to stay inside the city walls. Your job is to keep them comfortable, to keep them from suspecting that anyone is on to them, while I do my work." The thought of it made me feel physically ill. The thought of smiling at that woman, of helping her plan the destruction of my son. but I saw the cold, inescapable logic in Mark's strategy. It was the only way. "And your work?" I asked. "My work," he said, a grim smile touching his lips, "is to hire the best private investigators in Lyon. We're going to dig into the Moreau family. Every bank account, every credit card statement, every business dealing. We'll find out who their friends are, who their enemies are. We're going to find the truth behind their story of old money. People like this, they always leave a trail of debt and broken promises. And somewhere in that trail, we will find the proof we need. An email, a text message, a disgruntled ex-friend. We will find the smoking gun." He walked back to his desk and extended his hand. "It won't be easy, Arthur. Playing this part will test you. But if you can do it, if you can hold the line, I promise you, we will expose them." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, reassuring. I was no longer just a father in pain. I was a client, an ally, a soldier in a war I never wanted. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steady for the first time in 12 hours. "Whatever it takes." Leaving Mark's office, the city below seemed different. It was no longer just a collection of buildings. It was a web of secrets, a place of hidden intentions and calculated moves. My own intentions were now hidden. My own moves were now calculated. The silent storm had begun. My role was simple, and it was brutal. I had to become a ghost in my own son's life, silently watching, patiently waiting for the moment to strike. The weeks that followed were the longest of my life. I began to live a strange, bifurcated existence. There was the Arthur the world saw, the one my son saw. A quiet, retired professor, perhaps a bit melancholy, but supportive of his son's impending marriage. Then there was the real Arthur, a man living in a state of constant, vigilant warfare, a silent spy master in his own home, waiting for dispatches from the front line. My days were a carefully constructed performance. My nights were spent reading the encrypted emails that arrived from Mark Davis. The first report came 2 weeks after our meeting. It was a PDF file, locked with a password Mark had given me over the phone. The title was simple: Moreau Family Financials, Preliminary Report. I opened it, and the foundation of their lies began to crumble. The Moreau family was not old money. They were a house of cards drowning in a sea of debt. Mark's investigator in Lyon had painted a grim picture. Antoine, the patriarch, had a significant gambling problem, with outstanding debts to several less than reputable lenders in the city. Celine's venture, a chic fashion boutique, had gone bankrupt 18 months prior, leaving a trail of unpaid suppliers. Their ancestral home, the one they spoke of with such reverence, was mortgaged to its absolute limit, with a foreclosure notice pending. I read the cold, hard numbers and felt not a shred of pity, only a grim, chilling satisfaction. The story they had told us was a complete fabrication. They weren't just struggling, they were desperate, a drowning family looking for a life raft. And my son was that raft, made of gold. The very next day, I had to accompany Ethan and Isabel to look at a wedding venue. It was a sprawling, historic estate on the North Shore, a place of breathtaking beauty and equally breathtaking expense. Isabel glided through the manicured gardens, her hand linked with my son's, pointing at where the floral arrangements would go, where the string quartet would play. "Oh, Ethan, it's perfect," she breathed, looking up at him. "It's a place where we can begin our story. Something timeless, something with history. It's so important to honor the past, don't you think, Arthur?" She turned her brilliant smile on me, and I had to physically clench my jaw to keep from flinching. I was standing there, the digital ghost of her family's foreclosure notice burning in my mind, and I had to nod. "History is very important," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. Ethan beamed, proud that we were all getting along. "The deposit is a bit steep," he said with a nervous laugh, "but Isabel says you only get married once. We want to do it right." "Of course," Isabel added, her hand stroking his arm. "We must not think of the cost. We must think of the memory." I looked at her, this woman who spoke of timeless memories while her entire life was a temporary, fraudulent performance, and I felt a profound, exhausting contempt. This was my new reality. smiling through a pageant of lies, my silence a necessary, agonizing poison. The second report from Mark arrived 10 days later. This one was more explosive. The subject line was just a name: William Spencer. The investigator had uncovered a pattern. Isabel had been engaged once before, 2 years ago, to a British investment banker. The story was eerily similar: a whirlwind romance in Paris, a quick engagement, and plans for a swift relocation to London. But Mr. Spencer, it seemed, was more cautious than my son. He had insisted on a rather detailed prenuptial agreement. When Isabel's lawyers tried to contest every clause that protected his existing assets, his suspicions were raised. He hired his own investigator. The engagement was abruptly called off just weeks before the wedding. Mark's summary was blunt. "This isn't her first rodeo, Arthur. She's a professional. The British venture failed, so she set her sights on a new market. She found Ethan, a professional." The word echoed in my head as I sat with Ethan and Isabel in a ridiculously expensive tableware store in downtown Boston. Isabel was holding up 2 plates, one bone china with a delicate gold trim, the other a more modern, minimalist design. "I think the gold trim, don't you, Ethan?" she said. "It feels more permanent, more like a family heirloom." She looked at me for support. "A family is built on traditions, no?" "Traditions can be a wonderful thing," I murmured, my mind screaming. "A pattern of predatory behavior. A professional." She was talking about family heirlooms while her entire romantic history was a series of calculated business transactions. Later, over coffee, the topic of a prenuptial agreement came up. I was the one who broached it, as gently as I could. "Ethan, with your company, it's just a prudent thing to consider. Any lawyer would advise it." Ethan immediately bristled. "Dad, we're not talking about a business merger. This is my marriage." But Isabel's response was the true masterpiece. She placed her hand over Ethan's and looked at me with an expression of wounded sincerity. "Arthur, I understand your concern. You are a father protecting his son. But I could never. My love for Ethan is not something that can be written in a contract. If he feels he needs to protect his assets from me, then I have already failed. I want to build a life with him, not audit one." She looked as if she were about to cry. Ethan's face softened, and he looked at me with a mixture of love and disappointment. "See, Dad? This is why I love her. We don't need a prenup." I had to sit back, defeated, and watch her checkmate me with my own son. I had walked right into her trap, allowing her to further solidify her image as the selfless romantic, while casting me as the cynical, untrusting old man. It was a brilliant, sickening move, and my powerlessness was a physical weight in my chest. The final report from Mark arrived late on a Friday night. It was a single, heavily encrypted file named "The Smoking Gun." My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. It was a transcript of text messages, obtained legally by the French investigators from a former friend of Isabel's, a woman who had been burned in one of the Moreau's minor financial schemes. The messages were in French, a casual, arrogant shorthand that revealed the rotten core of their entire operation. I read them, and the last vestiges of any doubt evaporated into pure, distilled rage. To a friend named Chloe, "The fish is on the hook. The American is completely smitten. So naive, it's almost sad." Another, "His father is a boring old professor. I have to pretend to be interested in his dead wife. A small price to pay for the payout." And the one that made my blood run cold, sent just after Ethan had told her the new valuation of his company. "The ATM is fully funded. We are going to be so rich. Say goodbye to this miserable country and our miserable debts. Mon guichet automatique américain. My American ATM." I closed the laptop, my hands trembling slightly. I had it. The fortress of evidence Mark had spoken of was now built. The weapons were in my hand. The next evening, Isabel and Ethan came to my house for dinner. While Ethan was in the kitchen with me, Isabel wandered through my living room, the room I had shared with Sophie for 40 years. She picked up the silver-framed photo from my desk. When I walked back in, she was holding it, a pensive look on her face. "She was so beautiful," Isabel said softly, her voice full of feigned reverence. You must have loved her very much. I hope, I hope I can make Ethan as happy as she made you." She looked at me, her eyes glistening, the perfect picture of a loving, respectful daughter-in-law. And I had to stand there, her vile text messages burning in my memory, and look at this professional predator holding a photo of my wife while she planned to gut my son's life. In that moment, the performance almost broke. The rage and the grief were a physical pressure in my throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the photo from her hand and throw her out of my house, but I didn't. I held her gaze. I smiled a tight, painful smile. "I hope so too, Isabel," I said, because I knew with absolute certainty that the end was near. The charade was almost over. I had my proof. Now, all I needed was the right stage to present it. The file from Mark Davis was a monument to their greed. I had read it a dozen times, each reading hardening my resolve, chipping away at the father's grief and leaving behind the cold, sharp bedrock of a man with a mission. The text messages, the financial reports, the testimony from the British banker. It was a complete and damning portrait of a family of predators. The time for silent observation was over. The time for setting the stage for the final act had arrived. I called Ethan the next morning, carefully arranging my voice to sound warm, perhaps a little sheepish. "Son," I began, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About you and Isabel." I could hear the caution in his voice. "Okay, Dad. What about us?" "I know I've been hesitant," I said, letting a note of regret seep into my tone. "An old man's fear, I suppose. Change is difficult. But seeing how happy she makes you, seeing how you two are together, it's time I stopped being a stubborn old fool and started being a proper father." There was a silence on the line, then a sigh of pure, unadulterated relief from my son. "Dad, that means the world to me." "As it should," I continued, pressing my advantage. "And words are cheap. I want to do something, a gesture. I want to officially welcome Isabel into our family. I'd like to host an engagement party for you both. My gift to you." "A party? Dad, you don't have to do that." "I want to," I insisted, "at my club, the Avalon. We'll do it properly. We'll invite our friends, your business partners, everyone. We will celebrate this union, and I will personally introduce your fiancé to our world. It's the least I can do." The Avalon Club. The name hung in the air. It was a place of quiet power in the city. Its membership a curated list of old Boston families, academics and titans of industry. To host a party there was not just a celebration. It was a statement. It was the ultimate seal of approval. Ethan was ecstatic. It was more than he could have hoped for. The son who had been worried about his father's skepticism now had that father offering the most public and prestigious endorsement possible. He immediately passed the phone to Isabel, who cooed with delight, thanking me profusely, her voice dripping with the false sweetness I now knew so well. I could almost see her mentally calculating the social capital she had just acquired. In their minds, the game was won. They had not only secured the money, but the status that went with it. Their victory was complete. Over the next 2 weeks, I became the director of a play only I had the full script for. I met with the event coordinator at the Avalon, a woman named Catherine, whom I had known for 20 years. I planned every detail with the meticulousness of a historian preparing an exhibit. The menu was to be extravagant, the champagne French and flowing. A jazz trio would play softly in the corner. The lighting would be warm, golden, designed to make everyone feel comfortable and secure. The entire atmosphere was engineered to be a soft, luxurious cushion for the hard fall that was coming. Then came the guest list. Every name was a strategic choice. First, I invited my oldest friends, men and women who had stood by me when Sophie passed away, people who had watched Ethan grow from a boy into a man. They were my witnesses, the jury of my peers who understood the legacy I was fighting to protect. Next, I asked Ethan for a list of his most important business contacts, his key investors, the board members of his company, the partners at the venture capital firms who had funded his dream. He was thrilled. "This is huge, Dad," he'd said. "For them to see you so supportive, to meet Isabel in a place like the Avalon. It's a power move. I simply nodded. He thought the move was for his benefit. He didn't understand I was creating a board of inquiry for his personal life, ensuring that when the truth came out, it would be witnessed by the very people whose respect he valued most. There would be no room for rumor or speculation, only the cold, hard facts, presented in a room full of influential people. Finally, I sent the last invitation. It was an elegant, cream-colored card, engraved with the details of the party. I wrote the name myself in careful script, Mr. Mark Davis. When Ethan asked who he was, I gave a simple, truthful answer that was also a deception. An old friend from my university days, I said, one of the sharpest minds I've ever known. It's been too long since we've seen him. I think it's important for him to be there. The night before the party, I stood in my study. The suit I would wear tomorrow was hanging on the door, pressed and ready. On my desk, in a handsome leather briefcase, was the file, the fortress of evidence. Every piece of paper was a brick in the wall that would soon fall on the Moreau family. I felt no joy, no thrill of impending revenge, only a profound, heavy sense of necessity. I was about to break my son's heart in order to save his life. It was a father's terrible duty. The stage was set. The actors were all in place, confident in their roles. They were expecting a celebration. I was about to give them a reckoning. The Avalon Club was a symphony of success. The air hummed with the low murmur of important conversations, punctuated by the clinking of crystal glasses and the soft, sophisticated notes of the jazz trio. Golden light from chandeliers bathed the room, making everything and everyone look impossibly elegant. At the center of it all were Ethan and Isabel. My son, my brilliant, good-hearted son, was beaming, his arm wrapped possessively around his fiancée. He looked happier than I had seen him in a decade. And Isabel, she was a star in her own orbit. She was radiant, dressed in a stunning emerald green dress, the diamond on her finger catching the light with every graceful gesture. She moved through the crowd of my friends and Ethan's business partners with the effortless charm of a seasoned diplomat, winning them over one by one. To any observer, they were the perfect couple, the embodiment of a bright and promising future. I watched them from a small distance, a glass of sparkling water in my hand. I felt a profound, aching sadness as I looked at my son's unguarded joy. He was standing on a precipice, admiring the beautiful view, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. The performance was nearly over. It was time for the curtain to fall. As the waiters served the dessert course, I tapped a spoon against my glass. A gentle chime cut through the room, and the conversation slowly died down. All eyes turned to me. I saw Ethan give me a proud, encouraging smile. I saw Isabel look at me with an expression of perfect filial affection. I stood up, holding my glass. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice clear and steady. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate a truly wonderful occasion. As a father, there is no greater joy than to see your child happy. And for the past few months, I have seen my son, Ethan, happier than I have ever seen him. That happiness has a name, and her name is Isabel." I smiled warmly at her, and she smiled back, a picture of grace. The room was filled with soft, appreciative murmurs. "Isabel," I continued, still in English, "you are a woman of incredible charm, intelligence, and beauty. You have brought a light into my son's life that is truly a joy to witness. And it is time that I, and our entire family and community, officially welcome you." I raised my glass. "To Ethan and Isabel." A chorus of "To Ethan and Isabel" echoed through the room as everyone drank. I took a small sip of water. The first act of the play was complete. Now for the second. I set my glass down. "And now," I said, my voice softening slightly, "if you will all permit me, as a small tribute to Isabel and her family's wonderful heritage, I would like to say a few words in her beautiful native tongue." I saw Isabel's eyes light up. This was a bonus, an unexpected tribute that would further cement her status. She looked at her parents with a triumphant little smirk. My son looked at me with gratitude. I turned my gaze toward Isabel and began to speak in the fluid, perfect French my wife had taught me. The words flowed calmly, conversationally. At first they were just pleasantries about the beauty of France and the joy of a new union. Isabel and her parents beamed. Then, my tone shifted. "I would like to tell you all a short story," I said in French. "A fable. It is about a beautiful songbird, a kaya, with feathers like jewels and a voice like honey. This little songbird lived in a land of fading fortunes, and she dreamed of flying to a new world, a land of high, safe nests and plentiful bounty. But she did not want to make the long journey herself. So she found a young eagle, an eagle, strong and noble and a bit naive. She sang him her sweetest songs, telling him he was the most magnificent eagle in the sky. She promised to build a nest with him, to raise a family with him. As I spoke, I subtly pressed a small remote in my hand. Behind me, a large white screen, which had been retracted into the ceiling and gone unnoticed, descended silently. It flickered to life. The eyes of my guests, who had been listening with polite confusion, now widened. On the screen, in crisp, white English text, the words I was speaking in French were appearing in real time. I continued the fable, my voice never wavering. The young eagle, blinded by the songbird's beauty and her sweet promises, believed her completely. He offered to share his nest, his territory, everything he had built. But the little songbird had no intention of building a life with him. Her plan was simply to wait until the eagle trusted her, then take the nest for herself and push him out into the cold sky, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her false song. The room had gone utterly, completely silent. The only sound was my voice, speaking French, and the soft jazz from the trio, which now sounded like a funeral dirge. I looked at the Moreau table. The color was draining from their faces. Isabel's perfect smile was frozen, her eyes darting from me to the screen, a look of dawning, horrified comprehension on her face. Ethan was looking back and forth between me and them, his brow furrowed in confusion, not yet understanding, but sensing that something was terribly wrong. I brought the fable to its close. But the songbird made one fatal mistake. She did not realize that the old owl who watched over the forest, the one she dismissed as a relic of the past, understood her song perfectly. He had heard it before I paused, letting the silence stretch. I then switched back to English, my voice dropping to a low, serious tone as I looked directly at Isabel. This story is perhaps familiar to some in this room. Before anyone could speak, a figure rose from a table near the back. It was Mark Davis. He walked to the front of the room, his expression grim and professional. He was holding a thick, leather-bound folder. "Good evening," he said, his voice commanding the attention of every person present. "My name is Mark Davis. I am not just an old friend of the Sterling family. I am an attorney specializing in United States immigration law." A collective gasp went through the room. Isabel looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Mark continued, his tone cold and methodical. "For the past several weeks, at the request of my client Arthur Sterling, my firm has been conducting a thorough investigation into the background and intentions of Isabel Moreau and her family." He opened the folder. "The results of that investigation have been compiled into a formal report, which has already been submitted to the appropriate federal authorities." The screen behind him changed. It was no longer my fable. It was a slide presentation. The first slide was a financial summary. "The Moreau family," Mark announced, as pie charts and red negative numbers filled the screen, "is not a family of old money facing temporary hardship. They are a family on the verge of bankruptcy, with over 700,000 euros in gambling and business-related debts." The next slide showed a photo of a handsome British man. "This is William Spencer, a London-based banker. 2 years ago, Mr. Spencer was also engaged to Mademoiselle Moreau. The engagement was terminated when he uncovered what he described as a transparent attempt to secure his assets through marriage. A pattern of behavior is a key element in establishing intent." Isabel made a small, choking sound. Her father, Antoine, looked like he was about to faint. "But the most damning evidence," Mark said, his voice dropping, "often comes from the subject's own words." The screen filled with screenshots of text messages. They were in French, with the English translations beside them in bold red letters. The entire room could now read Isabel's private thoughts. The fish is on the hook. The American is completely smitten. His father is a boring old professor. I have to pretend to be interested in his dead wife. And finally, the kill shot. The text that appeared largest on the screen. The ATM is fully funded. We are going to be so rich. A wave of shock and disgust rippled through the audience. I finally looked at my son. Ethan was staring at the screen, his face as white as a sheet. His eyes were not on the words but on Isabel, and in them I saw his beautiful dreams shattering into a million pieces. He looked at her, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending betrayal. Mark Davis delivered the final legal verdict. A comprehensive report detailing a conspiracy to commit marriage fraud for the purposes of immigration and financial gain has been filed with United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, as well as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. As of now, the Moreau family is the subject of a federal criminal investigation. Any existing visas have been flagged for revocation, and they will be permanently inadmissible to the United States. Furthermore, he added, looking directly at Isabel, a civil lawsuit will be filed tomorrow morning on behalf of Ethan Sterling to recoup all financial expenditures made under fraudulent pretenses, including travel costs, living expenses, and the full market value of the 6-carat diamond engagement ring. The room was tomb silent. Isabel finally broke. She let out a guttural sob, a raw animal sound of pure defeat. Her mother Celine was openly weeping, her face buried in her hands. Antoine just sat there, shrunken and gray, a ruined man. I watched them, these architects of deceit, as their world collapsed around them in a room full of the very people they had tried so desperately to impress. The play was over, and there would be no applause. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom of the Avalon Club was a physical thing. It was heavier than any sound, a blanket of shock and disbelief that smothered every whisper, every clink of a glass. The jazz trio had faltered into silence, their last note hanging in the air like a question mark. All eyes were on the wreckage of the Moreau table, where 3 people sat, not as a family, but as 3 separate islands of ruin. Then, with the quiet efficiency that defined the club, it began. Mr. Harris, the club's director of security, a man I had known for years, appeared at the edge of the room. He was not a bouncer. He was an impeccably dressed gentleman in a dark suit, and he did not rush. He walked calmly to the table, his footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. He bent down and spoke to Antoine in a voice so low I couldn't hear the words, but the message was unmistakable. It was over. There was no argument, no final defiant outburst. The fight had gone out of them completely. They rose from their chairs like automatons, their movements stiff and uncoordinated. Celine's face was a mess of running mascara, a grotesque parody of the elegant woman who had entered the room hours earlier. Antoine seemed to have aged 20 years, his shoulders slumped, his eyes vacant, and Isabel, she was a ghost. The vibrant, confident woman was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger. She never once looked at Ethan. She couldn't. To look at him would be to acknowledge the humanity of the person she had tried to destroy. They were escorted out through a side door, a silent, shameful procession through a room full of strangers who now knew their darkest secrets. As the door clicked shut behind them, it felt as though a great poison had been drained from the room. Mark Davis caught my eye from across the room and gave me a single, solemn nod. My friends looked at me with expressions of sorrow and support, but I saw none of them. My entire world had narrowed to the still, silent figure of my son. Ethan hadn't moved. He stood frozen, staring at the empty chair where Isabel had sat, his champagne glass still held loosely in his hand. His face was utterly devoid of color, a mask of pure, stunned disbelief. He was a man watching a replay of a car crash in which he had been the driver, unable to process the totality of the destruction. I walked toward him slowly, my own heart aching with a pain that was entirely separate from the anger. This was the part I had dreaded. The victory was hollow. This was the cost. I stood beside him for a moment in silence. The guests began to murmur. the spell of the shock broken, unsure whether to stay or to go. I paid them no mind. I gently placed my hand on my son's shoulder. The touch seemed to break through his trance. He flinched, not away from me, but as if waking from a nightmare. He slowly turned his head, and his eyes met mine. For a second, they were just blank, unseeing. Then, the horror, the shame, and the overwhelming pain flooded in. His face, the face of a 35-year-old man, a successful CEO, crumpled like a child's. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, but neither of us noticed. He didn't say a word. He just collapsed into me, his arms wrapping around me, his face buried in my shoulder. And for the first time since he was a small boy who had fallen from his bicycle, my son wept. He sobbed uncontrollably, great wrenching sounds of a heart breaking. It was the sound of a beautiful dream dying, of trust being murdered, of a future turning to dust. I held him, my own eyes burning with tears. I held my son as his world fell apart, and in that moment, there was no victory, only the profound, aching cost of love. He finally pulled back, his face streaked with tears, his eyes red with shame and agony. "Dad," he choked out, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I was so blind. I'm so sorry." I shook my head, pulling him back into an embrace. "There is nothing to forgive," I whispered, holding him tight. "You have a good heart. You wanted to see the best in her. That is a gift, not a flaw." I just held him, letting him cry, offering the only thing a father could in that moment, a safe harbor in the ruins of his life, a silent promise that even after the worst storm, he would not be alone. 3 months passed. The autumn that had begun with such tension gave way to the quiet chill of early winter. The storm had passed. I received one final, brief call from Mark Davis. The Moreau family had been deported the week after the party. Their visas were permanently revoked. Upon their arrival in Lyon, they were met not by family, but by French authorities investigating charges of fraud related to the long list of creditors Mark's team had uncovered. Their chapter in our lives was closed, not with a bang, but with the quiet, final click of a bureaucratic lock. They were no longer our problem. They were a problem for the French legal system. The real work, the quiet work of healing, was what remained. The change in Ethan was profound. The exuberant, almost naive optimism was gone, replaced by a more sober, thoughtful maturity. He was quieter, but he was also more present, more observant. The ordeal had stripped him of his illusions, but it had revealed a deeper strength I had always known was there. In early December, we flew to France together. We rented a small car and drove through the Loire Valley, the skeletal vines of the vineyards tracing intricate patterns against a pale winter sky. We didn't talk much about what had happened. We didn't need to. The shared silence was not one of distance, but of deep, unspoken understanding. Our destination was a small, quiet village nestled in the hills, the village where Sophie had been born and where she had asked to be buried. We stood before her grave, a simple stone marker overlooking a valley. The air was cold and crisp. Ethan placed a small bouquet of white roses on the stone, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, looking at his mother's name. "She would have known right away, wouldn't she?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," I said softly, "she would have." He turned to me, his eyes clear and full of a sad, newfound wisdom. "You saw what I couldn't, Dad. You didn't just hear the words, you listened. I don't think I ever really knew how to do that until now." He reached out and put his arm around my shoulder, and we stood there together, two men bound by a love for the woman buried in the French earth and by the painful truth that had brought us back to her. As I stand here now, back in my quiet study in Boston, I often reflect on the events of that autumn. It would be easy to call what I did an act of revenge, but in my heart, I know it wasn't. Revenge is a hot, blinding fire. What I did was a kind of cold, necessary surgery, an intervention to save my son from a sickness he couldn't see. It was an act of protection, the final duty of a father. I have come to understand that language is a curious thing. We think of it as a tool for communication, a bridge between two minds. But it is also a key to a locked room, the soul of a person. What we say to those we want to impress is a performance. What we say when we think no one of importance is listening is the truth. Isabel's mistake was not realizing that I held the key to her locked room, a key my wife had given me 30 years before. The most important lessons I've learned are often found in the conversations we were never meant to hear. To protect the ones you love, you must learn to listen to the silence. You must learn to read the words written in invisible ink between the lines of every pleasant conversation. It was a painful truth to uncover, one that broke my son's heart. But truth, I have learned, is like the foundation of a house. It is hard and it is unforgiving, but it is the only thing upon which a life of any meaning can be built. You cannot build a lasting love on a lie. In the end, I did not destroy a family. I simply held up a mirror and let a house built on sand be washed away by the tide. And in its place, my son and I have started to build again, on solid ground. This story is a powerful reminder that true listening goes beyond just hearing words. It's about observing the details, understanding hidden intentions, and recognizing that the most dangerous threats often wear the most charming masks. It teaches us that protecting those we love doesn't always mean being loud. Sometimes it requires patience, strategy, and the courage to use a painful truth as a shield. True strength isn't found in avoiding conflict, but in facing deceit with quiet wisdom, proving that a foundation built on lies, no matter how beautiful, can never withstand the simple, heavy weight of reality. What was the most powerful lesson you took from Arthur's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more tales where wisdom prevails.